Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxby. Today we are delighted to welcome the Brexiteer and businessman, Professor Daniel Hodson, a director of Vote Leave. Professor Hodson has served as the CEO of the London International Financial Futures Exchange, as well as a professor at Gresham College. Professor Hodson, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to talking to you.
Daniel, I'd like to jump straight into our conversation. Obviously, we have all been impacted in various ways by the coronavirus crisis. What has been your overall assessment so far of how the British government has handled the crisis compared to other Western nations?
That's a very difficult question to answer in a way, because of course our country is different in so many ways from not just European nations, but nations throughout the world. And it's to do with things like population density, constitutional arrangements, and so on. So in a way, judgment isn't necessarily easy. However, I think that, first of all, one has to say that the government inherited an almost impossible situation. Any government of any stripe would have had difficulties handling what they've had to handle. And of course, one has to remember the politicians only sit on the top of everything. Underneath, the people who are going to pull the levers, the National Health England, the National Health Service, other people, are actually part of the public sector, which is much broader. And the difficulty, I think, has been that a lot of the public sector, particularly, I think, National Health England and the National Health Service, have not necessarily had this sort of problem as a priority. However, I think that the first thing to say is that the government's approach, which appears to have been based largely on, as far as they possibly could, following scientific advice, seems to be a sensible one. I think that has had traction. I think that on the whole, the results have been reasonably good, although I think that politically it's been damaging for the government in the short term, because inevitably there's been criticism. And I think some of the criticism has been fair, some hasn't been fair. And part of the free speech environment in which we live is that people should be able to speak, and the media should be able to speak as they want. So I think that the government as a whole will emerge from this crisis, which isn't over yet, of course, with its reputation probably somewhat damaged. I think the good news is, of course, that they have a very substantial majority in Parliament. That seems to be holding firm. There have obviously been a degree of dissent, and there are another 4 and something years to go. So there's plenty of time to make up. And of course, there is still the major issue of Brexit yet to be addressed, which no doubt is what we want to talk about most of all, I think, Jonathan, in this discussion.
You read my mind. Daniel, I'd like to talk a lot about the consequences, but just sticking with the government's response for a moment. The economic response, what do you think of the Chancellor's response, the Treasury's response, and how do you think that is going to play out over the next 3 to 6 months?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I mean, the whole thing about this whole situation is that there's so many, the range of alternatives is so wide. We know the range of scientific opinion is very wide, even now. I personally believe in the entrepreneurial spirit of the British people. I think that we will probably recover more quickly than perhaps some believe. Certainly, I think if you look at, for instance, going back prior to all this happening, at the Treasury forecast of the impact of Brexit, you'll see that they were hopelessly pessimistic. And I believe that the pessimists amongst forecasts at the moment are going to be proved wrong. But it's early days yet, and we'll have to wait and see. I think that there are opportunities springing from this. There always are. The law of unexpected consequences applies under changed circumstances. And some are going to be differences in the way in which we do business. There are going to be changes in the property market. There are going to be changes in our trading patterns. And there'll be changes in social attitudes. And we don't know what they're going to be. We've only just started this journey, I think, and this is the fascinating thing. The most important thing is, one thing I do believe, is that any British government, any likely British government, whether it be to the left or to the right, I think is going to be in charge of a nation who are more equipped to handle change than most.
Interesting you say that, Daniel. I mean, we can think of the world economy almost as a sort of interconnected spider's web. Um, and, we hear, for example, very good noises coming from New Zealand. But of course, until a country's major trading partners come online, any given country is going to be operating at a sort of, not at maximum. They're going to be sort of stuck in second gear. You've mentioned there some of the potential consequences. I'm thinking today, for example, about the impact of the easing of lockdown, pubs, bars, and restaurants operating without outdoor spaces, and of course, the Great British weather being what it is. We're not in the Mediterranean. We may see problems with that. People having to pint outside when it's raining. It's not like sunny Spain here. What do you think about some of what the economy may look like in the coming months? And do you think there could be some positive benefits? It sounds like you do, based on what you just said. Do you think there could be some real positive benefits for the economy and perhaps how we work?
Well, I think that, taking your latter point, how we work is going to be very interesting. I think that one of the consequences of this has been a change in our attitude to property. We know that the retail sector has been hugely damaged. The office sector is going to be very interesting because it may be that people have to have bigger spaces in offices. An office space may be more in demand. The way that we work when we're in an office environment next door to each other, whilst obviously some office space may be taken up from home working, nonetheless, I think that people have found a balance between home working and office working is probably where they want to be in the end. And so you may see a greater demand, for instance, for commercial office space. I think that might read across also to the retail sector. And you're absolutely right to emphasize the problems of pubs and restaurants, which are the heartblood of this nation. I suspect that we're going to have to arrange ourselves, drape ourselves around pubs in a more distanced way. And that will mean more space. I don't think it's going to stop people from using them. I think we're just going to have to get used to new habits. There is, of course, a particular issue which is coming up at the moment. It is could be front of page soon, and that is the 1 meter distancing rule. Scientific opinion seems to vary on that at the moment, but we know that the government are looking at it, and that would make some kind of a difference. But going back to a previous point, and that is, I think that the fundamental change has been people's ability, and yours, mine, to work from home. And I really do think that's going to change the way that people see working in the future. And it may change as it were, the fundamental structure of businesses which employ people in offices. Less so in the manufacturing environment, because clearly in that environment, it's terribly important that people are working together in some way. Distancing will still have to apply, but you can't apply it in the same way that you could in an office.
About some of the geopolitical implications, Daniel. I mean, there have been calls for some kind of reset between the Western world and China, calls to changes to be made to supply chains, perhaps onshoring of critical industry. There's the case perhaps to be said that the West has become over-dependent on Chinese industry. One could argue the UK has perhaps the best higher education system in the world outside of the United States, some of superstar universities. Very well placed pole position perhaps for some of the growth technologies of the next century. What do you think about a potential reset with China and the potential for the onshoring of critical industry and the development of new technologies?
You raised an awful lot of questions there. So let's start with China. I think the Chinese situation is very interesting. It's going to be very, very difficult in the short term for China in the public perception to recover. And if anything, it's getting worse. We learn in today's news that this virus may have actually started to infect people back last autumn. And so that itself will color things. I think also people are beginning to realize, and their minds really skipped over it in the past, the extent to which China has infiltrated throughout the world, the way that it is invested in countries, particularly poorer countries, but countries which would be useful in terms of supplying raw materials. Throughout Europe, it's invested. And I think it's very important now for people to sit back and look at, as it were, the strategic ambitions of China and think about it in terms of the way in which we in the West consider our position. Now, there are clearly, if you take the trading level, trading implications, huge numbers of things that we consume here are manufactured in China. They don't have to be. There are alternative sources, and I think that it's going to be very important for us to explore them. And indeed, I think it's going to be important for us to explore them on the basis of existing cultural, political, and trading relationships, for instance, in India. But there are other nations like Korea, South Korea, like Taiwan, like Vietnam, where we could also be establishing relationships which will be similar in characteristic to China. And bear in mind also that China is a developing nation. It won't necessarily be able to maintain the sort of pricing and availability that it has in the past.
True.
So I think that China is the first issue, and that will be the first resetting. However, you raise a very interesting point about our universities. And one of the difficulties, of course, is that universities, like a lot of educational institutions, have very high fixed overheads. And many universities have attempted to offset those overheads by bringing in foreign students. There is a real question mark about those foreign students, both in terms of universities and indeed, particularly our independent sector, our independent secondary school sector, the public school sector, and the private school sector generally, because of this. That's not to say that universities won't thrive, and you're absolutely right. We lead the world in so many ways in terms of our academic research. But I think that one of the things we have to be extremely careful of is to make sure that the universities which really matter survive, because I suspect that some won't, at least they will merge. And that, of course, will be one of the negative consequences of what's happened here.
Mm. That's interesting. Now, leaving the coronavirus crisis time being, you mentioned Brexit, and that's obviously what we want to particularly focus on. Right now, the EU and the UK are in these transition negotiations. This is a period during which the UK remains in the single market and customs union, even though it has officially left the EU. We no longer have representation in European Parliament. Of course, British money is still going to Brussels. It is, in a way, taxation without representation, and we accept the situation provided it only goes on for a short period. It's due to end in December. We're coming up this month to the deadline for any extension. Downing Street has been absolutely adamant that there will be no extension to the transition period. So let's start with this. We hear a lot of noise about how the disagreements between the two sides, they seem to be fairly far apart. What's been your assessment of how the transition negotiations have gone so far?
Well, I think they've gone predictably. And the interesting thing is that both sides have so far stuck to their red lines. The most obvious and front red lines are fishing and the level playing field issue. And it's very difficult to see how that impasse can be broken. The government's rhetoric clearly implies that they are determined to stick by that situation. There is a suggestion that some concession on tariffs might lubricate the wheels. I think one of the problems that Barnier has is that he has 27 masters behind him, and they have a whole range of different interests. One hears, for instance, that the coastal economies who are most affected by fishing are very concerned about what the fishing situation. Actually, I personally believe that our position on fishing is about as strong as it possibly can be, because at the end of the day, those are our waters. But we do need to prepare, if we take a hard line on this, for the fact that we're going to have to defend our waters, to put it no higher than that. The level playing field issue is also important, and it's very difficult to see how there could be a resolution. What interests me is that there has been an increasing awareness of some of the aspects of the withdrawal agreement, which underlies these negotiations alongside the political declaration. These problems are associated principally with the Northern Ireland Protocol, but there are other aspects in terms of the continuing rule of the European Court of Justice, which itself has been undermined by German Constitutional Court, but that's another issue. And the question is, and these are important, by the way, because they could impact on things like state aid rules, which cover huge amounts of government transaction and involvement in industry. And there is a question as to whether or not the withdrawal agreement is one which nearer the time the government may actually consider changing. Now, it can change that by negotiation, as part of the negotiation. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but it could also, bearing in mind the withdrawal agreement is part of a treaty, go about it by repudiating that treaty under international law based on the behavior of the European Union. And I think that that is one of the most interesting aspects of this, is that one could see a situation as we approach, as the red lines are maintained, as we approach the end of the year, that we could begin to see a difference in attitude of the British government to its current treaty commitments under the withdrawal agreement.
Do you think, as we assuming the June deadline is passed, do you think the EU may also change its mind? It might be holding out hope that there will be some wobbling on the UK side, and perhaps after that the EU might themselves start to make some concessions. Do you think we might see a change then?
Well, one hopes so. I mean, I think that the EU has been informed by what it reads about in the press. And I think it very often doesn't value enough the fact that this government has a massive majority in Parliament. And on the whole, the British electorate, which is a very intelligent body, by the way, the British electorate,
I agree.
The British electorate are still very much behind what the government is doing. And issues like fishing are pretty iconic, frankly. So, you know, I think that they underestimate, and I think it's a big mistake. That said, the way to go about this, I think, is to go behind Barnier's back. He is a negotiator, but his brief is provided by 27 states, of whom one or two are the most important, notably Germany being the most important in general terms, in what you might call in monetary and fiscal terms, and France to a degree, of course, as Germany's partner, and not least in the fishing negotiations, where French fishermen are a strong lobby within France itself.
Do you think the Northern Irish Protocol, Daniel, do you think that represents a brewing problem?
Yes and no, it's there. I mean, I think that the aspects of the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Irish Protocol, to which I referred, for instance, the fact that as long as Northern Ireland decides, as it were, to stay within the single market, theoretically, at any rate, the European Court of Justice has some kind of control over state aid throughout Great Britain. I think that's something which isn't properly realized by many people in this country, that there is this continuing control. That's pretty inimical. And it also, in effect, has a degree of control on what the British government can do because of the leak across into Northern Ireland. Attitudes in Northern Ireland, I think, are capable of change. I think it's very difficult to predict how long they will live with the current arrangements and whether sooner or later they will vote, as it were, to join the rest of Great Britain. But I think that there's going to be, certainly in the future, coming months, a lot of focus on this, as I say, and the commitments which we have had to make in the withdrawal agreement in a much more difficult negotiating period for the British government. I think we're in a much stronger position now, and I think that's generally borne out by the way that we've handled these negotiations.
And Daniel, if there is no trade deal, if the UK has to revert to so-called WTO terms, does that represent a problem or not?
Well, of course, you're going to read about all the issues which will be issues in industries which will be affected by this. And of course, they'll be varied. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. One of the unexpected consequences of the epidemic has been the fact that the argument that the supply chains will be disrupted on a WTO-based Brexit is not so strong, simply because those supply chains are already damaged by what's happened, and they'd have to be reconstructed anyway. There is the very strong argument that British trade, export trade, has grown significantly and much more rapidly outside the European Union than it has inside the European Union. It isn't as if under WTO rules we stop trading with the European Union. There are lots of products of ours which they'll want to continue to buy. A weaker pound may well help, and certainly will help our manufacturing industry. And you, in an earlier question, Jonathan, mentioned reshoring. I think reshoring is a really interesting opportunity, particularly for an area which you don't often hear discussed, but again has its own iconic quality, which is farming. I think there is a considerable amount of interest in that. And one particular aspect of farming is the dairy industry, where I worked myself for 11 years. I was finance director of what was then called Unigate, at a time when I think between 80 and 90% of our milk was delivered to the doorstep, and it was all British milk. But I think there are all sorts of opportunities, for instance, for that industry, which didn't exist or don't exist at the moment, but will exist post-Brexit. And you're going to see other industries as well, which will be able to develop, I think. And of course, the other one, just to end this part of our conversation, which clearly can rebuild, is fishing. Fishing has been decimated over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And this is a real opportunity to rebuild it. And I think that coastal communities around the country will be hoping that this government delivers a deal which enables them to do exactly that, and they'll benefit.
Yes, Danny, it makes me think that with coronavirus, in a sense, all economic bets are off, and any disruption that could occur, and we are going to see almighty disruption anyway from the crisis. You mentioned farming there, Daniel, and that makes me think about the recent trade negotiations with the United States. Now, in addition to negotiations between the EU and UK, there are negotiations going on, trade negotiations between the UK and the US, led by Liz Truss on the UK side, Robert Lighthizer on the US side. Have been some criticisms about this. We've heard in the press concerns about agricultural standards. What do you think about that? And also, what do you think about the overall potential of a UK-US trade deal?
Well, clearly, the overall potential is massive. It's massive both in terms of political, the political statement that it makes, and certainly my experience for the nearly 10 years that I've been involved in this Brexit campaign is that there is massive willingness at a political level to do this business with us. At the end of the day, it's the Congress, the US Congress, which has to approve it. And I think within the US Congress, there's massive support for this. There are some issues, and of course, chicken is the one which is often cited. But I believe that with goodwill, those will be overcome. And I think that this does represent a huge opportunity for us. So I believe that, and I also believe that that the whole opportunity for us within the Anglosphere is massive. The US is just the beginning of it. We can see other opportunities. You have recently written an article relating to Kanzuk. Clearly that's important. I mentioned India, and I include them in the Anglosphere. And also, of course, there are a number of other Commonwealth countries like New Zealand, we've also talked about in Australia, and countries in Africa. There are other issues too, which are interesting. One forgets, not only does the spoken language combine us all, but one has to remember that our constitutional and cultural attitudes are very similar. One of the things that a lot of Brexiteers have really attempted to set out at the highest level in terms of the reasons why they want Britain to become again a totally sovereign nation is the use of the way in which we are, or law is written. In this country, you can do it unless we say you can't. On the continent, the concept of Napoleonic law, which is the basis of most of the law on the continent, is that you can't do it unless you say we can. And that already creates difficulties in terms of the regulatory differences. And it's interesting that our approach to regulation, and I was a regulator, you mentioned my work in the city, I was a regulator in those days. We were a self-regulating organization, the life market, was that it was outcomes-based. The way in which we ran the market was to ensure that the right outcome was reached. And very often you could do that more by principle than you could by prescription and the framework in which the market operated. So that is another difference. And I think that these approaches will permeate the arrangements that we have, but one can see a huge opportunity based on the Anglosphere. And of course, the biggest stake in the ground in economic terms is going to be the US.
You mentioned something very close to my heart there, Daniel. As you say, I've written about this issue before. And there will be those kind of course, it's worth saying that anything that can be produced in Europe can be produced in the US and the other Commonwealth countries combined, probably the US on its own. There would be those, however, listening to our conversation who would say, look, the UK is walking away from this, 450 million strong trade organization, political bloc right on its doorstep. There's no way that any trade deal with the United States or the Commonwealth could ever compensate for the loss the UK is going to see by walking away from the EU. What would you say to that?
Well, I actually hugely dislike this language. I know that you're quoting, so I'm not getting at you, but walk away and the cliff edge, which is implied, crashing out, that's complete rubbish. That isn't the way it's going to happen. People will continue to have their holidays on the continent of Europe, will continue to trade with the continent of Europe. There will be a few more difficulties, but you know, the way that people behave is not determined by governments. It's determined by individuals, by organizations which are independent. And one of the areas that certainly I've been working on quite closely with a number of other people recently is in trying to campaign on behalf of independent businesses, the sort of people who are really going to rebuild the British economy, family-owned businesses, management-owned businesses, private businesses, and they will be making sometimes difficult decisions. Sometimes it can be more difficult for them, but they will have the determination to get through. And I think all that, those millions and millions of small decisions by individuals, by companies, and so on and so forth, will actually mean that all these rather florid expressions like walk away, like crashing out and so on, simply won't happen. It's just good media stuff, but it doesn't represent the truth of the outcome.
And Daniel, by the time this video goes live, this question may be academic, but I'll ask it anyway. There are those who are claiming, as we come up to the deadline in June, we should, it's been all shoulders to the wheel on the coronavirus crisis. It would be the responsible thing for the UK government to fall back a little bit and to push back the end of the transition period. My take is that if that were to happen, if the UK did blink, then the US and other countries with which the UK is negotiating a trade deal would question the UK's resolve. What would you say to those people who are calling for a delay?
Well, I just don't sense. Their argument might be a lot stronger if if there wasn't this huge distance between the red lines of the two negotiators. But it's absolutely clear that there is no significant movement at this stage. It'd be very interesting to see what the Prime Minister, what Boris Johnson discusses and negotiates with those working, as it were, and supporting and providing Monsieur Barnier with his instructions when he meets them. I think at the moment it's said to be on the 19th of June. It'll be very interesting to see what happens then. But my instinct is that these red lines will remain far apart. Under those circumstances, there's absolutely no point in extending anyway. And what purpose would it serve? It would simply just mean we go on talking. And something that you mentioned earlier in this discussion, we'd be, and the EU would hardly object, we'd be paying more money into their coffers at a time when, frankly, we need every pound that we can accumulate.
I'd like to speak a little bit more in a moment about the state of the EU and the potential future bailouts there, and what would happen indeed if the UK was still part of the club, as it were. But just going back for a moment to Kanzak, you mentioned the potential. I would argue these are some of the healthiest countries in the Western world. This is a burgeoning alliance compared to the EU. The trust and the bonds are already embedded in the Commonwealth realms. We've spoken a little bit about the economics, and perhaps you'd like to speak a little bit more about that too. But what about on the geopolitical side? Perhaps greater military interoperability, greater geopolitical clout and reach from the Commonwealth realms realigning with each other. What do you think about that as well?
I think that's a very interesting concept, and I think one of the things which really hasn't been debated sufficiently and may well start to be debated, unfortunately, possibly in the context of fishing, is our military capacity. Of course, I include our naval capacity too. The significance of our presence as an ally in many countries, and particularly in relation to the United States, in NATO, in the Far East, in relation to support given to countries with whom we have close relationships over there, should not be underestimated. And our ability to maintain a presence there in a supportive military way without any kind of imperial ambitions, because they're always going to be, when you open these kind of debates, those who say, you're just hankering after the empire. And of course, we're not. We accept the reality of modern Britain, and such things are not sensible. But we are highly respected. We have extremely good defense forces. And that leads into another issue, which is that if we were to stay in the EU, increasingly, it's clear, and you only have to look at the developments, that the European Defence Force is going to become a fairly central issue. And already there is a creeping assimilation of what we're doing into that. And it's time, frankly, that we severed that cord. One of the things that has been headlined, particularly on the continental side, of the benefits of the EU, has been the fact that it's prevented war in Europe since the Second World War. The fact is that that has been principally NATO, and frankly, principally supported by the United States, and to a lesser extent Britain, and indeed France, to give them their credit where it's due. And so one has to recognize, on the one hand, that we need to be free of that, and the European Defence Force is their matter. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that in support of our trading relationships, our defensive abilities and our ability to support our trading partners could be a very important asset.
Yes, I agree, Daniel. Of course, with regards to the arguments about misty-eyed nostalgia, nobody ever accuses the Russians of misty-eyed nostalgia with the Commonwealth of Independent States or the Eurasian Economic Union. They recognize things have moved on, but they want to keep a strong alignment with those countries. And I think the Commonwealth realms Kanzak idea is the same. So we've spoken a little bit about the EU and the eurozone. So let's go on to that. How do you think the coronavirus crisis is going to impact the EU and eurozone going forward? We've seen, for example, the Corona bonds debacle, where the predominantly northern European countries were objecting to common debt issuance with the hard-hit southern European countries like Italy and Spain. What do you think of the situation in the EU and eurozone right now?
Well, I think those who've studied the eurozone, as it were, strategically, have long since identified its Achilles heel. The Achilles heel is that it is a zone with a currency, but it isn't controlled by a sovereign country.
Absolutely.
It has monetary control through the European Central Bank, but it does not have fiscal control.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely on display at the moment. And the particular issue, which has brought this forward, is the decision of the German Constitutional Court, which said in effect, look, European Central Bank, you're stepping too much into the fiscal side of things. And it said no to that. Now, the latest rescue package is potentially flying in the face of that decision by the German Constitutional Court. The interesting thing about the German Constitutional Court is that it is just that it is rooted in the German Constitution, which cannot be changed by treaty. So it appears certainly to be sovereign. So one of the aspects of this, of course, is that the German Constitutional Court, to some extent, is in effect sovereign over part of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Interesting constitutional dilemma in its own right. But it does illustrate the difficulties that the Eurozone as a whole has in holding the euro together as a currency. We saw a near miss a few years ago with Greece, and it's interesting that Mr. Varoufakis has been loud and clear about the difficulties which the Greek government got itself into by remaining, by certainly negotiating in a certain way, caving in effect. But of course, the main thing was to keep Greece in there. The difficulty, of course, is that this is such a disparate group of nations. So I think that there are some real threats there. The key to it is in Germany, not in terms of the Constitutional Court itself, but the extent to which they, and that's a political issue for the German people, are prepared, in effect, to bail out the rest of the continent. We've also seen the impact of the so-called Frugal Four, and whether or not they will actually be talked around into supporting this new package. It's early days yet, but it's certainly not resolved, and it continues to undermine the insecurity, the basic framework of the Eurozone. I suppose I could end this element of our conversation by pointing out that when the members of the Eurozone, the non-members of the Eurozone diminish to 4, then we lose any vetoes we have. And that would be a moment, and it could take place in this decade, on the assumption things continue as they are, where the British people again, I think, as they were in the early noughties, faced with a question of whether they should join the euro, because it's certainly going to be on the cards. And were we to stay in Europe, in the continent of Europe, in the European Union, I should say, for the long term, then I have no doubt that sooner or later we would be obliged to join the euro. As indeed, by the way, would, if this occurs, a departing Scotland.
Daniel, you mentioned about the Frugal Four and the potential bailouts, and I think there could be a creeping federalism in there as well. I'd like to speak about that. Just going back for a moment to the German Constitutional Court ruling, it was a huge moment. Do you think there are some implications more broadly for Europe from that ruling, that other courts in other countries may follow suit, may follow the German example?
I think it's difficult to judge. Certainly, I don't have the knowledge of the constitution, the judiciary side of the constitution of every European country. These are relatively new constitutions. That, of course, is another, if you like, strategic issue, is that our constitution has been honed over nearly 1,000 years. Most of theirs, with one or two notable exceptions, are post-war, and they're still developing, and they have different balances between the legislative and the judiciary, and indeed different, as we're finding out, a different degree of openness, of accountability. So I think that the thing about the German Constitutional Court is that it was the German Constitutional Court that did it, and that is pretty central. Other courts may, if they have the capacity, but I don't think that's the critical issue. I think that it's simply undermined the constitutional weaknesses of the current situation, and it's also undermined, as we were discussing before, the weakness of the eurozone and the measurable probability that the euro will not be with us for that much longer.
Daniel, you mentioned the issue of having a single currency without a single government. I've often characterized the EU and eurozone as a union without a demos. You mentioned about these disparate nations. You spoke about the Frugal Four and the bailouts. I mean, we can almost hear the Euro federalists, who in many ways do at least, even one may disagree with them, they do at least have an honest position. One can almost hear them say, look, national politicians have to answer to national electorates. Wouldn't it be so much easier if we had one common European, pan-European politicians answering to one pan-European electorate? With the bailouts and everything that has happened, do you think there will be a creeping federalism in Europe?
It's difficult to tell. At the moment, the reaction, I think, is going the other way. I think I used the expression of a famous Chinese politician, too early to tell, and I think he was speaking in 1950 about the impact of the French Revolution. And I've always taken the view that, rather like the British Constitution, history is a much longer drama than men's lives. The real problem with the European Union is that conceptually, the idea of a federal Europe may or may not be something whose time will come. But the people who wanted it, and they undoubtedly had positive motives in terms of dreaming it up, the Monets of this world, they tried to do it much more within their own lifetimes. It's been over-accelerated. There may be a role for it, but it certainly isn't yet, not in the way that sovereign states behave, think, the culture, and so on and so forth. So in strategic terms, I would never rule out the possibility of a federal Europe, but I doubt whether it will be in my lifetime. Certainly won't be in my lifetime. I doubt whether it will be in yours, Jonathan. And I think it may be maybe a century or two ahead. Of course, we don't know how technology will change over the years. We don't know whether something entirely different, which will be traced back to 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, will not change the way that people treat each other throughout the world and the nation state. But I think that the nation state is currently too strong for that. What I can see, there will be a movement towards creeping federalization, but I doubt whether it will actually occur in the short term.
In the short to medium term, Daniel, do you think there is a threat of sovereign debt crises in the eurozone?
That's a very interesting question. And of course, we saw that in relation to Greece. And I think the Greek example is very, very important. Greece, of course, is a relatively small country. You could see a sovereign debt crisis of much more massive proportions cropping up in relation to Italy and Spain. And yes, I think there is quite a strong probability. One of the issues which we've not touched on is an interesting one, which is the way in which European EU banks are capitalized and their treatment of what you might call member state debt, which is said to be risk-free. It's treated as a risk-free in terms of building up their capital on their balance sheets. Actually, that means that to a large extent, they are significantly undercapitalized. They're undercapitalized because quite clearly, if you look at the Greek experience, the value of Greek debt or Italian debt is what you might call significantly less in terms of risk than the value of German debt, although each is treated the same for the balance sheet purposes of those banks. And one could see a potential there for quite a damaging situation in relation to the bank structure and the potential fragility of the banking sector on the continent based on that problem.
Daniel, whether there is...
Could I just mention one other thing?
Sure, go ahead, yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please. I think another issue which is understated and one should take the opportunity to put across is do not underestimate the importance of the City of London, its markets and its liquidity to support any changes on the European continent. Liquidity is a very fragile thing. It resides in London very largely, and it would be difficult to move it across in bits to other European centers. So the quality and the liquidity of London markets and continuing, and they will, is going to be hugely important in terms of supporting whatever measures the EU take. But the issues like the one that I just mentioned in terms of the valuation of the risk perception of member government debt is the sort of thing which has to be overcome, probably rather in the short term than the medium term.
Daniel, you just mentioned the City of London, so I'll just add a quick bonus question. Presumably you think that those people who claim that with Brexit, the City of London is going to lose out to Frankfurt and Paris, that is not going to happen.
I don't see how it can, because I don't think they are basically large enough centres. I think that if anything, I certainly entered this campaign partly on a national campaign with a thing called the People's Pledge and then Business for Britain, but also I've been working with another entity called the City for Britain. And after the election, we reached out to Remainers, the referendum, I should say, we reached out to Remainers and set up an organization to try to help with the negotiations called the Financial Services Negotiation Forum. And the city, being the city, reacted very quickly, and they could very quickly see that they had to take account of all alternatives, including a WTO-based Brexit. And it's interesting now to see that the main campaigning organization for the City UK, have accepted the fact that this is more than likely to happen and that the city is ready and prepared for it. And I think it is. You don't hear the sounds of panic and concern that these great markets will move to across the way that you did a couple of years ago. And it goes back to a point I made before, and that is there is a much better understanding of the quality of these markets, the depth of these markets, the liquidity of these markets now than there was then, and the realization that you simply can't move markets like that. They're not like a herd of, not like a swarm of bees that you can move from one rooftop to another. with a Pied Piper sort of person. It doesn't work like that. Those markets are not like that. So I'm reasonably positive about that. And I do not see, certainly in terms of these negotiations, the city being a form of leverage which would be effective, frankly, in terms of getting a better deal for the UK, in terms of concessions and so on and so forth.
Daniel, before we wrap up, we spoke, the question before last, about the issue of sovereign debt crisis. We've spoken about federalism. Presumably, whether the EU and eurozone goes down the federalist route, I know you think that's not going to happen anytime soon, or whether it moves towards this integration, the UK should be well out of there, because certainly if there's more bailouts, the UK would be potentially on the hook for those bailouts if the transition period was extended.
Yes, I think that's right. If I didn't make that point earlier, I thought I had mentioned that. It's certainly true that if there is an extension then of the transition period, then clearly we would have to continue paying. And as I said before, I mean, frankly, we have other concerns in terms of what we do with our hard-earned cash, I think, in this country.
Daniel, we've spoken about a lot today, the coronavirus crisis, Brexit, trade deals, Kanzuk, and all the rest of it. Pulling all that together, if you had one prediction, broad forecast, broad prediction for the next 6 to 9 months, could be about the economy, could be about society, politics, could be domestic, could be international, what would that prediction or forecast be?
Well, I think that I would say that I believe in the entrepreneurial spirit of the British people, and I believe in the common sense and intelligence of the British electorate. And I think the combination of that and a government which has a strong majority will mean that 6 months from now, there will be massive change created by the virus, but I think we are in as good a position to meet that and grow on it and use the opportunities and diminish the downside as we possibly could be. So you can tell, Jonathan, I'm a bit of an optimist, but I've always been that way, and I've always felt when I first started on this journey that Brexit was a goal worth achieving. And I think that Brexit will form a very, very positive part of the prosperity and growth of this country.
Daniel, that sounds like a great note on which to finish. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can find us on Facebook and on Twitter, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time.